Do not ask me how long my unexpected lapse into slumber lasted, or how much of what I ensued was sheer dream. If I tell you that I waked at a certain time and heard and saw certain things, you will merely answer that I did not wake then, and that everything was a dream until the moment when I rushed out of the house and stumbled to the shed where I had seen the old Ford and seized that ancient vehicle for a mad, aimless race over the haunted hills, which at last landed me, after hours of jolting and winding through forest-threatened labyrinths, in a village which turned out to be Townsend. You will also discount everything else in my report and declare that all the pictures, record sounds, and cylinder and machine sounds and kindred evidences were bits of pure deception practiced on me by the missing Henry Ackley. You will even hint that he conspired with other eccentrics to carry out a silly and elaborate hoax, that he had the express shipment removed at Keene, and that he had Noise make that terrifying wax record. It is odd, though, that Noise has not even yet been identified, that he was unknown at any other villages near Ackley's place, though he must have been frequently in the region. Wish I had stopped to memorize the license plate of his car. Or perhaps it is better after all that I did not. For I, despite all you can say, and despite all I sometimes try to say to myself, know that loathsome outside influences must be lurking there in the half-unknown hills, and that those influences have spies and emissaries in the world of men. To keep as far as possible from such influences and such emissaries is all I ask of life and future. When my frantic story sent a sheriff's posse out to the farmhouse, Ackley was gone without leaving a trace. His loose dressing gown, yellow scarf, and foot bandages lay on the study floor near his corner easy chair, and it could not be decided whether any of his other apparel had vanished with him. The dogs and the livestock were indeed missing, and there were some curious bullet holes, both on the house's exterior and some on the walls within. But beyond this, nothing unusual could be detected. No cylinders or machines. Beyond this, nothing unusual could. None of the evidences I had brought in my valise. No queer odor nor vibration sense. No footprints in the road. And none of the problematical things I glimpsed at the very last. I stayed a week in Brattleboro after my escape, making inquiries among people of every kind who had known Ackley, and the results convinced me that the matter isn't of no figment of dream or delusion. Ackley's queer purchases of dogs and ammunition chemicals, and the cutting of his telephone wires are matters of record, while all who knew him, including his son in California, concede that his occasional remarks on stage studies had a certain consistency. Solid citizens believe he was mad, and unhesitatingly pronounce all reported evidences mere hoaxes devised with an insane cutting, and perhaps abetted by eccentric associates. But the lowlier country folk sustained his statements in every detail. He had shown some of these rustics his photographs in Blackstone, and had played the hideous record for them. And they all said the footprints and buzzing voice were like those described in ancestral legends. They said, too, that suspicious sights and sounds had been noticed increasingly around Ackley's house after he found the black stone, and that the place was now avoided by everybody except the mailman and other casual, tough-minded people. Dark Mountain and Round Hill were both notoriously haunted spots, and I could find no one who would ever closely explore either. Occasional disappearances of natives throughout the district's history were well attested, and these now included the semi-vagabond Walter Brown, whom Ackley's letters had mentioned. I even came upon one farmer who thought he had personally glimpsed one of the queer bodies at flood time in the swollen West River, but his tale was too confused to be really valuable. When I left Brattleboro, I resolved never to go back to Vermont, and feel quite certain I shall keep my resolution. Those wild hills are surely the outpost of a frightful cosmic race, as I doubt all the less things since reading that a new ninth planet has been glimpsed beyond Neptune, just as those influences had said it would be glimpsed. Astronomers with a hideous appropriateness they little suspect have named this thing Pluto. I feel beyond question that it is nothing less than a knighted Yuggoth, and I shiver when I try to figure out the real reason why its monstrous denizens wish it to be known in this way at this special time. I vainly try to assure myself that these demoniac creatures are not gradually leading up to some new policy hurtful to the earth and its normal inhabitants. But I have still to tell of the ending of that terrible night in the farmhouse. As I've said, I did finally drop into a troubled doze. A doze filled with bits of dream which involved monstrous landscape glimpses. Just what awaked me, I cannot yet say, but that I did indeed awake at this given point, I feel very certain. My first confused impression was that of stealthily creaking floorboards in the hall outside my door, and of clumsy muffled fumbling at the latch. This, however, ceased almost at once, so that my really clear impressions began with the voices heard from the study below. There seemed to be several speakers, and I judged that they were controversially engaged. By the time I listened a few seconds, I was broad awake, for the nature of the voices was such as to make all thought of sleep ridiculous. The tones were curiously varied, and no one who had listened to that accursed phonograph record could harbor any doubts about the nature of at least two of them. Hideous though the idea was, I knew that I was under the same roof with the nameless things from abysmal space, for those two voices were unmistakably the blasphemous buzzings which the outside beings used in their communication with men. The two were individually different in pitch, accent, and tempo. But they were both of the same damnable general kind. A third voice was indubitably that of a mechanical utterance machine connected with one of the detached brains in the cylinders. There was as little doubt about that as about the buzzings, for the loud, metallic, lifeless voice of the previous evening, with its inflectionless, expressionless scraping and rattling, and its impersonal precision and deliberation, had been utterly unforgettable. For a time I did not pause to question whether the intelligence behind the scraping was the identical one which had formerly talked to me. But shortly afterward I reflected that any brain would emit vocal sounds of the same quality if linked to the same mechanical speech producer, the only possible differences being language, rhythm, speed, and pronunciation. To complete the Eldridge colloquy, there were two actually human voices. One, the crude speech of an unknown and evidently rustic man, and the other, the suave Bostonian tones of my erstwhile guide Noise. As I tried to catch the words which the stoutly fashioned floor so bafflingly intercepted, I was also conscious of a great deal of stirring and scratching and shuffling in the room below, so that I could not escape the impression that it was full of living things, many more than the few whose speech I could single out. The exact nature of the stirring is extremely hard to describe, for very few good bases of comparison exist. Objects, it seemed now and then to move across the room like conscious entities, the sound of their footfalls having something about it like a loose, hard surface clattering, as of the contact of ill-coordinated surfaces of horn or hard rubber. It was, to use a more concrete but less accurate comparison, as if people with loose, splintery wooden shoes were shambling and rattling about on the polished board floor. On the nature and appearance of those responsible for the sounds, I did not care to speculate. Before long, I saw that it would be impossible to distinguish any connected discourse. Isolated words, including the names of Ackley and myself, now and then floated up, especially when uttered by the mechanical speech producer, but their true significance was lost for want of continuous context. Today, I refuse to form any definite deductions about them, from them, and even their frightful effect on me was one of suggestion rather than revelation. A terrible and abnormal conclave, I felt certain, was assembled below me, but for what shocking deliberations I could not tell. It was curious how this unquestioned sense of the malign and the blasphemous pervaded me, despite Ackley's assurances of the outsider's friendliness. With patient listening, I began to distinguish clearly between voices, and even though I could not grasp much of what any of the voices said, I seemed to catch certain typical emotions behind some of the speakers. One of the buzzing voices, for example, held an unmistakable note of authority, whilst the mechanical voice, notwithstanding its artificial loudness and regularity, seemed to be in position of subordination and pleading. Noise's tones exuded a kind of conciliatory atmosphere. The others I could make no attempt to interpret. I did not hear the familiar whisper of Ackley, but well knew that such a sound could never penetrate the solid flooring of my room. I would try to set down some of the few disjointed words and other sounds I caught, labeling the speakers of the words as best I know how. It was from the speech machine that I first picked up a few recognizable phrases. The speech machine brought it on myself, set back the letters in the record, and on it, taken in, seeing and hearing, damn you, impersonal force. After all, fresh, shiny cylinder. Great God. First buzzing voice. Time we stopped. Small and human. Ackley. Brain. Saying. Second buzzing voice. Nyarlathotep. Wilmarth. Records and letters, cheap and posture, Noise. An unpronounceable word or name, possibly Naga Kathun. Harmless. Peace. Couple of weeks. Theatrical. Told you that before. First buzzing voice. No reason. Original plan. Effects. Noise can watch. Round hill. Fresh cylinder. Noise's car. Noise. Well, all yours. Down here. Rest. Place. Several voices at once in indistinguishable speech. Many footsteps, including the peculiar loose stirring or clattering. A curious sort of flapping sound. The sound of an automobile starting and receding. Silence. That is the substance of what my ears brought to me as I lay rigid upon that strange upstairs bed in the haunted farmhouse among the demoniacal hills. Lay there, fully dressed, with a revolver clutched in my right hand and a pocket flashlight gripped in my left. I became, as I've said, broad awake, but a kind of obscure paralysis nevertheless kept me inert, till long after the last echoes of the sounds had died away. I heard the wooden, deliberate ticking of the ancient Connecticut clock somewhere far below, and at last made out the irregular snoring of a sleeper. Ackley must have dozed off after the strange session, and I could well believe that he needed to do so. Just what to think or what to do was more than I could decide. After all, what had I heard beyond things which previous information would have led me to expect? Had I not known that the nameless outsiders were now freely admitted to the farmhouse? No doubt, Ackley had been surprised by us unexpected visit from them. Yet something in that fragmentary discourse had chilled me immeasurably, raised the most grotesque and horrible doubts, and made me wish fervently that I might wake up and prove everything a dream. I think my subconscious mind must have caught something which my consciousness had not yet recognized. But what of Ackley? Was he not my friend, and wouldn't he not have protested if any harm were meant me? The peaceful snoring below seemed to cast ridicule on all my suddenly intensified fears. Was it possible that Ackley had been imposed upon and had used a lure to draw me into the hills with the letters and pictures and phonograph record? Did those beings mean to engulf us both in a common destruction because we had come to know too much? Again, I thought of the abruptness and the unnaturalness of that change of the situation which must have occurred between Ackley's penultimate and final letters. Something, my instinct told me, was terribly wrong. All was not as it seemed. That acrid coffee which I refused. Had there not been an attempt by some hidden, unknown entity to drug it? I must talk to Ackley at once and restore his sense of proportion. They had hypnotized him with their promise of cosmic revelations, but now he must listen to reason. We must get out of this before it would be too late. If he lacked the willpower to make the break for liberty, I would supply it. Or if I could not persuade him to go, I could at least go myself. Surely he would let me take this Ford and leave it in a garage at Brattleboro. I noticed it in the shed, the door being left unlocked and open now that peril was steamed past. And I believe there was a good chance of being ready for instant use. That momentary dislike of Ackley, which I had felt during and after the evening's conversation, was all gone now. He was in a position much like my own, and we must stick together. Knowing that his indisposed condition, I hated to wake him at this juncture, but I knew that I must. I could not stay in this place till morning as matters stood. At last I felt able to act, and stretched myself vigorously to regain command of my muscles. Arising with a caution more impulsive and then deliberate, I found and donned my hat, took my valise, and started downstairs with the flashlight's aid. In my nervousness, I kept the revolver clutched in my right hand, being able to take care of both of the valise and flashlight with my left. Why I exerted these precautions, I do not really know, since I was even then on my way to awaken the only other occupant of the house. As I half tiptoed down the creaking stairs to the lower hall, I could hear the sleeper more plainly, and noticed that he must be in the room on my left, the living room I had not entered. On my right was the gaping blackness of the study in which I heard the voices. Pushing open the unlatched door of the living room, I traced the path with the flashlight toward the source of the snoring, and finally turned the beams on the sleeper's face. But in the next second, I hastily turned them away and commenced a cat-like retreat to the hall. My caution this time springing from reason as well as from instinct. For the sleeper on the couch was not Ackley at all, but my quondam guide, Noise. Just what this real situation was, I could not guess, but common sense told me that the safest thing was to find out as much as possible before arousing anybody. Regaining the hall, I silently closed and latched the living room door after me, thereby lessening the chances of waking Noise. I now cautiously entered this dark study, where I expected to find Ackley, whether asleep or awake in the great corner chair was evidently his favorite resting place. As I advanced, the beams of my flashlight caught the great center table, revealing one of the hellish cylinders with sight and hearing machines attached, and with a speech machine standing close by, ready to be connected at any moment. This, I reflected, must be the encased brain I heard talking during the frightful conference, and for a second I had a perverse impulse to attach the speech machine and to see what it would say. It must, I thought, be conscious of my presence even now, since the sight and the hearing attachments could not fail to disclose the ray of my flashlight and the faint creaking of the floor beneath my feet. But in the end, I did not dare to meddle with the thing. I only saw that it was the fresh, shiny cylinder with Ackley's name on it, which I noticed on the shelf earlier in the evening, which my host had told me not to bother. Looking back at that moment, I can only regret my timidity and wish I had boldly caused the apparatus to speak. God knows what mysteries and horrible doubts and questions of identity it might have cleared up. But then, it may be merciful that I left it alone. From the table, I turned my flashlight to the corner where I thought Ackley was, but found to my perplexity that the great easy chair was empty of any human occupant, asleep or awake. From the seat to the floor there trailed voluminously the familiar old dressing gown, and near it on the floor lay a yellow scarf and huge foot bandages I thought so odd. As I hesitated, striving to conjecture where Ackley might be and why he had so suddenly discarded his necessary sick-room garments, I observed that the queer odor and sense of vibration were no longer in the room. What had been their cause? Curiously, it occurred to me that I had noticed them only in Ackley's vicinity. They had been strongest where he sat, and wholly absent except in the room with him, or just outside the doors of that room. I paused, letting the flashlight wander about the dark study and racking my brain for explanations of the turn affairs had taken. Would to heaven had I quietly left the place before allowing that light to rest again on the vacant chair. As it turned out, I did not leave quietly, but with a muffled shriek which must have disturbed, though it did not quite awake, the sleeping sentinel across the hall. That shriek and noises still unbroken snore are the last sounds I ever heard in that morbidity-choked farmhouse beneath the black wooded crest of a haunted mountain, that focus of a transcosmic horror amidst the lonely green hills and curse-muttered brooks of a spectral rustic land. It is a wonder that I did not drop flashlight, valise, and revolver in my wild scramble, but somehow I failed to lose any of these. I actually managed to get out of that room and that house without making any further noise, to drag myself and my belongings safely into the Ford and the shed, and to set out that archaic vehicle in motion towards some unknown point of safety in the black, moonless night. The ride that followed was a piece of delirium out of Poe, or Rimbaud, or the drawings of Doré. But finally, I reached Townsend. That is all. If my sanity is still unshaken, I am lucky. Sometimes I fear what the years will bring, especially since that new planet, Pluto, has been so curiously discovered. As I implied, I left my flashlight, returned to the vacant easy chair after its circuit around the room, then noticing for the first time the presence of certain objects in the seat, made inconspicuous by the adjacent loose folds of the empty dressing gown. These are the objects, 3 in number, which the investigators did not find when they came later on. As I said at the outset, there was nothing of actual visual horror about them. The trouble was in what they led one to infer. Even now I have my moments of half-doubt, moments of which I have half accept the skepticism of those who attribute my whole experience to dream and nerves and delusion. The 3 things were damnably clever constructions of their kind, and were furnished with ingenious metallic clamps to attach them to organic developments, of which I dare not form any conjecture. I hope, devoutly hope, that they were the waxen products of a master artist, despite what my inmost fears tell me. Great God, that whisperer in darkness with its morbid odor and vibrations, sorcerer, emissary, changeling, outsider, that hideous repressed buzzing. And all the time in that fresh, shiny cylinder on the shelf. Poor devil. Quote, prodigious surgical, biological, chemical, and mechanical skill, unquote. For the things in the chair, perfect to the last subtle detail, of microscopic resemblance or identity. For the face and hands of Henry Wentworth Ackley,